Wouldn't it be great if you could apply a super durable, scratch-resistant polyester UV cured finish on an electric guitar without having to use any spray equipment or expensive UV curing systems? Well, with Solarez polyester gloss resin, you can do that, and I'm going to show you how in this video. Ultimately, the quality of your finish depends on how well you prep sand it in the beginning. I start with an 80 grit to remove all the tool marks and to level the surface. Then I'll move through 100, 120, 150, and then finish with 220 grit sandpaper. To pop out that grain, I'll use a water-based brown dye. Then I'll sand off the excess, leaving the dye just in the grain itself. For color, I'm going to throw down some vivid red water-based dye. I should also mention that I'm applying Solarez in my garage/workshop. This is actually an ideal place to do it because there are no windows in here, and because Solarez cures by exposure to sunlight, we don't want any sunlight pouring into the room. And if that's the situation you're in, you're gonna want, and you have like a big window with sunlight streaming in, you're gonna want to close the curtains and close any doors to prevent sunlight from coming in. I do have overhead lights, but they won't affect the Solarez. You do, however, want to make sure that the room is reasonably well ventilated because Solarez puts off some pretty strong fumes. And for that reason, you're also going to want to wear a mask that is suitable for protecting your lungs from chemical fumes. And I would also recommend that you should not apply Solarez in your living space because of the odors that it does produce. I'll be using two products from Solarez to clear coat this guitar. The first is going to be their UV cured grain sealer, and then the second is going to be their polyester gloss resin. The UV cure grain sealer goes down first, and what it will do is it will produce a sealed surface and a barrier coat that the polyester gloss resin can bond to. And when I say it bonds to it, it really glues itself to the surface. It's like it's welded. And that's important because the polyester gloss resin can be somewhat finicky about adhesion, especially if you're using an oily wood like cocobolo or if you've used an oil-based stain. To apply the grain filling sealer, I just pour a little bit out onto the body, and then I'll just use a cheap hardware store 2-inch wide paintbrush to spread it around. And you might be tempted to use an old paintbrush you've got sitting in the garage, but I wouldn't recommend doing that because when paintbrushes have been sitting around, they tend to collect dust and lint, which will deposit into the finish. I'll brush the grain filler over the entire surface of the guitar, and then once that's finished, I'll take an old business card and just scrape the excess off. All I want to do is leave the filler in the pores in the grain and then just distribute the rest of it in a thin film across the surface. As soon as I finish scraping it off, I'll take it out into the sun for 60 seconds until it's bone dry. Then I'll bring it back inside and repeat the process up to 4 times until I have the grain completely filled and the surface thoroughly sealed. Now it's time to brush on a single thick coat of the polyester gloss resin. I'll apply this in much the same manner as I did the grain filler using a brush. However, I will not be squeegeeing off any excess. I'm going to apply this stuff fairly thick, and then I'll let it flow out. Okay, so what I've done here is I clamped the guitar into a vise that's on my bench, and the reason I'm doing that is because I'm going to let the guitar sit for the next roughly 90 minutes because that will allow the polyester gloss resin to flow out nicely. Since I haven't added any kind of MEKP catalyst to speed up the curing process, I'm going to be relying purely on sunlight to cure it. And for that reason, until it's exposed to sunlight, the resin stays wet. And as long as the resin's wet, it can continue to move and flow, and that allows the brush marks to disappear and for the surface to finish to get very even and smooth. It also allows any vapor that's trapped in the resin to escape. I've noticed that if you don't give it adequate time to level and rest, you'll notice there are tiny little pinholes in the finish, and that's because there's vapor trapped in it. But if you let it sit for, a good 90 minutes, that's more than long enough for that vapor to escape from the resin. So I'm going to be coming out here every couple of minutes, and I'll probably flip the guitar body a few times just to keep gravity in check, because I can already see a few runs and drips forming, which is no big deal because all I have to do is just brush those out and wait 5 minutes or so, and the surface gets nice and level again. But my main concern right now is just to let it sit and rest and let that vapor escape from the finish. And then once that 90 minutes is up, we'll be ready to take it outside and cure it in the sun. Okay, so our 90 minutes is up, and I am ready to take the guitar out into the sun and cure the Solarez. I'm going to do this in 2 steps. First, I'm going to take it outside and expose it to the sun for about 10 seconds on each side, and then I'll bring it back in for about 5 minutes. What this will do is, as I understand it, I don't know the chemistry for sure, but from what I understand, it helps to ensure that there won't be any little pinhole bubbles in the resin. So we'll do that first, and then after that we'll go back out and then do 3 minutes on each side to finish the cure.
As the Solarez cures in the sun, you'll notice a slight haze spread across the surface. That's nothing to be concerned with. It'll disappear once you level sand and buff out the finish.
Alright, well, I got the Solarez fully cured, and as I said before, I went outside and did an initial 10-second cure on each side, and then brought it back out of the sun for 5 minutes, and then took it back out for the final full cure, where I exposed each side for about 3 minutes, and it is completely bone dry. So I'm ready for the next step, and that is to start level sanding. So we'll get started with that. Solarez is a real challenge to level sand because of how hard it is after it's cured. It's much, much harder than nitrocellulose lacquer or polyurethane, true oil, water-based acrylic lacquers, and the other kind of products that we like to use to clear coat. In fact, I almost liken it to sanding a sheet of plate glass. That's how hard it is. As a result, I have to start sanding at a much coarser grit than I normally would if I were sanding, for example, nitrocellulose. Usually with nitrocellulose, I'll start at about 800 grit. But with this, with the polyester gloss, I have to back down to 220 grit to get started. And the strategy that I'm going to use to level sand is a little bit different. Instead of taking the 220 and leveling out the entire surface perfectly, what I'll do is I'll sand it until it's about 75% level. When you look at the surface, I can see that I have kind of a consistent mix of dull and shiny surface. And the dull is what is the high spots that have been sanded. The shiny is the lower spots that the sandpaper hasn't reached yet. So I just try to get the majority of it sanded dull. Then I'll start to move through the grits, and I'll go next to 320, then I'll go to 400. And usually by the time I'm done with 400, the surface is completely level. Then I'll jump to 800, and that's when I start removing a lot of the sanding scratches. And then I'll go on to 1,000, 2,000, 4,000. And you'll notice I'm not wet sanding. I actually haven't wet sanded a finish in years. Sandpaper technology has really improved over the years, and now we have these no-load papers which perform very well. You don't need to use water as a lubricant or mineral spirits or whatever you use. The advantage of that is you can actually see your progress more readily. With wet sanding, you have to sand and then wipe down the surface to dry it so you can see what you've done. But this, you can actually see it in real time. So it's a little faster. And it's especially useful in working close to edges and on contours. You can really see what you're doing as you're doing it. And I think that greatly reduces the risk of sand through. So this is how the surface looks after sanding with 320 grit. There's a couple of shiny spots left, but it's about 90% of the way level. So I'm going to switch now to 400 grit, and that should take it down to the last 10%, so it'll be perfectly level. I've finished level sanding with 400 grit, and right now the surface is pretty smooth. There are no shiny spots left, and so I'm ready to jump to 800 grit and begin the polishing process. Polish sanding with 800 grit is really basically the same as level sanding. The only difference is instead of looking at shiny spots, I'm looking for any remaining scratches left over from the previous grits, and I'll work on those areas a little bit more to get rid of them. Right now I'm really not seeing too much. There's a couple here and there. Usually the scratches are concentrated around the perimeter, so those are the areas I really have to concentrate on and work to smooth out. The sandpaper that I like to use for polishing at this stage is 3M's 216U. This is a P800, and it's also called Free Cut Gold, and it's a fantastic sandpaper. It's low clog, very consistent abrasive grit size, so you get a really smooth scratch-free surface. I finished polish sanding with the 800 grit, and now I have a decision to make, and that decision is going to be based on how I'm going to do the final buff on the guitar. I use a buffing machine, which you can see there in the corner. It has two large buffing wheels, and I'll use a couple of different polishing compounds to get my final high gloss shine. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be using, these are Mirka Abralon sanding pads, and I use 1000, 2000, and 4000 grit to finish, and the process is pretty simple. It's just a matter of sanding by hand the surface. Because it's a foam pad, finger pressure is equalized, so I can get a pretty consistent sanding, and I'll work through both grits. It's kind of hard to tell when it's time to move from one grit to the other, but I just make sure I give it a good once over, and you know, that seems to work fine. And then once I've gone through the 4000, then it's time to hit the buffer, which I'll show you in a minute. But if you're going to be buffing out by hand, or maybe using one of those foam pads on a drill, what I would recommend doing is using micro mesh sanding abrasives, and you'll want to go with all the grits from 1500 all the way up to 12,000. And I think once you're done with the 12,000, you can start the process of the hand buffing and get a pretty nice finish. I'm not going to show that method because I use like I said, I use my buffing machine to do this. But if you're going to do that by hand, I would recommend picking up a bottle of 3M's Finesse It 2 rubbing compound, and that's what you would start with. That's your main scratch remover, and then switch over to something like Meguiar's plastic polish, and that'll give you the final high gloss shine. All right, we're done with all the polishing, so now we're ready to buff. My buffing machine spins at 900 RPM, and I use Two 12-inch wheels on each side. This one is dedicated to coarse compound, and then two more. This is a softer 12-inch wheel, two of them on this side, and those are dedicated to very fine polish. And what I'm using is, this is the Manzurna Brown, and this is the Manzurna, I guess you could call that tan. I don't really quite understand their color coding, but I know that this is very fine and this is coarse. So let's get started. All right, I have finished buffing out the guitar, and as you can see, it's highly polished. This turned out pretty nice. And the other nice feature of Solarez is the fact that this finish is bulletproof. I have yet to encounter a finish that has the durability and scratch resistance that Solarez polyester resin has. And I think probably the best feature of Solarez is the fact that I can brush it on in the morning and have it buffed out to a high gloss shine in the afternoon. So there you have it. That's basically the techniques that I use for applying the Solarez polyester gloss resin finish.